in Europe, you see, in France, they have the lycée has the baccalaureate system with philosophy as part of it. It's a core content. Anyway, Samuel Beckett, bless him, he was one of the saints and sages of today that we celebrate. And he illustrates this thing, that Ireland and France and Europe are a joined up, place. He lived in Ireland, he lived in France. And he was a European intellectual. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature. Then we have another great thinker we celebrated today called Tagore. Now Tagore is a great Indian Hindu sage, Rabindranath Tagore, who was from Calcutta. And I've been to visit his house. He was born in 1861 on the 6th of May, which is 2 days before my birthday. Like me, he was a Turian, a lover of life. And he was the first Indian to win a Nobel Prize in any field. He won it for literature. He was a poet, an artist, a musician, an educationist, and a mystic. And he was the son of Debendranath Tagore, who was a great universalist thinker in the traditions of the Brahmo Samaj, which was a reforming movement in Indian society, which, like Jacob Frank, was arguing, why do we have all these divisions between, Hindu or Buddhist or Christian? Let's have a universal movement for joined up spirituality, which they call the Brahmo Samaj. Let's all find the one unity. And this man, Debendranath Tagore, was a pioneer of that. He brought up his children to believe that. And he acquired land, founded an ashram, and he promoted Hindu-Christian dialogue for peace. He himself was a great man. He was called Maharishi and died in 1905. And his son, 14th child, no less, was our hero today, Rabindranath, who began writing poems at the age of 13. Well, I totally associate this because I did the same. I think I started writing at the age of 12 in Kemp Town. My mother was influential because she had so many great poetry books in the library, which I would dip into and read. It inspired me. And I had a brilliant English teacher at Brighton Hove and Sussex Grammar School. And I just found poetry spoke to the human condition, the human soul. And I'm sure Rabindranath had the same feeling. He also, from about the age of 16, had mystical visions, and he was writing and studying about religions. He was inspired by the Upanishads, the Bhakti poets, the Buddhist texts, the Vaishnava tradition, and the songs of the bulls. These were wandering mystics and bards. But he was also liberal politically. He studied Western philosophy, he studied Kant and Hegel, and he knew that Western liberalism is a precious thing as well, because it's an antidote to totalitarian rulers, to religious-inspired, theocratic fanatics who will suppress freedom of thought. During his lifetime, he composed 2,000 songs, hundreds of poems, plays, essays, short stories, and novels. And he won the Nobel Prize for Literature. In The Religion of Man, a series of lectures in 1930, he put forward some of his main philosophical ideas. He believed that we can learn from the sacred texts of all religions, but we have to internalize them and actualize them in ourselves. We have to become the Rishi of the Upanishads, become the Bodhisattva of the Buddhist sutras or whatever. Religion, he said, consists in the endeavour of men to cultivate and express those qualities which are inherent in the nature of man, the eternal, and to have faith in him. Anyway, hats off to him. He was also a Freemason in the Indian schools, and a universal mystic, and well deserved his Nobel Prize for Literature. So we celebrate him today. And when I went to Calcutta, it was an amazing adventure I had, invited by my dear Indian friends to go and speak at a Jain conference, and then I went on to Calcutta by train. I wanted to visit Shantiniketan, which is the ashram. His father bought the land, Rabindranath built it up as basically a university now. It's still functioning. It's a place for joined up intellectual work of a high order. Because, as I'm saying, the curriculum of our schools is what's failed us over Brexit. But it's also the curriculum of our universities. I've proposed a gifted and talented programme in universities. Tony Blair proposed it in schools. I say we want one in universities. Worldwide, not just in Britain. The whole of Europe, the whole of India. You know, there are new generations of youngsters, hopefully some of them will listen to my talks, who are tomorrow's geniuses, who realise what I'm saying about joined-upness, who listened to people like Tagore and Jacob Frank and the others, and realise we have to go beyond the boxes. We want not just to reaffirm our place in the European Union, but to make it better, more joined up, more interconnected. And we don't just want interconnectivity that comes from IT, that comes from technology. You know, we don't want 5G. We want organic interconnectivity that comes from love. We want the humanities and arts and spiritual sciences to have as much kudos in Europe as does IT and maths and technology and stuff. We won't get to heaven on technology alone. It has to be the thinking of our software within the human heart that operates and directs the technology. So, yeah, Tagore founded this university ashram, Shanti Niketan, which then influenced the Elmhursts in Dartington. They built Dartington College, which, you know, I know and love well, Dartington. I've spoken there. It's a great place where experimental work is done in the arts. I know people who graduated. It's now connected to the University of Plymouth. And long may it last, long may it live. That's the joined-upness we need, places like Dartington. But, you know, we need more of them. That's why I think we should have, like the Norwegians and Swedes and Danes, have a tradition of what they call folk high schools. Every big town, even medium-sized towns in Norway, Sweden and Denmark, have a folk high school, which is like a place for adult education, where people can go of all ages and learn all kinds of skills, practical stuff like woodworking, lace making, candle making, but also deeper stuff like peace studies, theology, spirituality, you know, whole gamut of courses, and they're all virtually free, pay only a little bit, like the Workers' Education Association classes in Britain. And they all have like a building where you can go and study after work. These are open in the evening, night school. Well, they should be in every British city. They should be all over, you know, Leicester, Derbyshire, Mansfield, Nottingham, Cambridge, you know, should have folk high schools up and down the country, because we need to become a country that loves education, that values learning, that cares about wisdom more than about money and status and jobs. That's the Tory path. Dog eat dog, you know, let's just scrabble. And that's their thinking behind Brexit, is we'll be richer. I mean, the joke is that, of course, it's the complete opposite. They didn't read the small print when they all thought Brexit's a great Tory idea. And they don't have the intellectual courage to come clean with the British people and say, yeah, sorry, we got it wrong. David Cameron says he's now come out for Boris Johnson's deal. I mean, has the guy had a moral lobotomy? David Cameron started this nonsense. He should be apologising down on his knees to the British people and walking in sackcloth and ashes from John O'Groats to Land's End with a big placard on his back saying, I'm sorry about Brexit, I got it wrong. Cancel and let's have another referendum, you know. And David, I challenge you to do that and show a bit of remorse. But probably he won't, because he comes from that class that games the system and has been doing it for 300 or 400 years and is very happy with suffering as long as it's kept to the poorer classes. And they go on, you know, creaming at the elite levels and benefiting from the dissension because all their money's parked offshore anyway, like the children of pirates that they are. Well, sorry, no. Time's up, guys. You can no longer run this country. You're not fit to be in charge. And, I think David Cameron should be doing community service. These are criminals, these people. And as for Boris Johnson, yeah, he can join the same placard walk. Now we come to a Buddhist of today, Venerable Kalu Rinpoche, who is one of the great Buddhist sages of our time. He lived from 1905 to 1989. I didn't meet him, but I know people that did. He was a senior meditation master of the Kagyu order, which is one of the most esoteric of Tibetan Buddhist orders. It's the people behind Sami Ling, which I've been to and spoken at many times, and also the Holy Island, which is owned and run by Sammy Ling. He lived in Darjeeling after 1960 when he fled from Tibet, and was a teacher of the 16th Karmapa and the present Dalai Lama. So this man, Venerable Kala Rinpoche, was greatly admired throughout the Buddhist world. He founded at least 50 Dharma centres around the world, established the first 3-year retreat centres where you can do in-depth training in the West, and he's known as a modern Milarepa. He was also a poet and a mystic. So he practiced Bremain tradition, which is the ecumenical universal school within Tibetan Buddhism that says, let's bury the differences between sectarian groups. Let's study the universal common wisdom that underlies all dharmic paths. And he was a master practitioner of Bremain. So I 100% support that vision. That's really what I'm talking about. As a universal thinker, that universal ecumenical Bremain tradition of Buddhism, I'm saying it should be extended to all faiths. We need it. We need a universal Bremain. And I've been doing for the last 30 years the scholarship that makes that possible. I can announce proudly to humanity it is possible. Not only that, it's necessary, right? We're not gonna survive unless we get to that universal place. That's what Alan Watts was saying, for instance, as a Christian theologian way back when. Now we come to our Christians again. So the point I'm making about Kalu and Bremain is that, again, that universalism, ecumenism, is what the EU stands for. That's why we have a European Union, because we're not just stuck in our boxes as English or French or Belgian. We're complex beings, multidimensional beings. We're enlightened Buddhas in evolution. We're in the process of Christification, if you want, each of us. And we need an educational system that brings that out. We need a political system that brings that out and encourages concord and peace and reconciliation and truth-speaking. And as Marianne Williamson says, the whole truth and nothing but the truth. And for that, we need to up the game of education. And Marianne, hi, you need to do that in the States. First job you do when you get to be president, and I've got my fingers crossed, is appoint a very good education minister to increase American schooling. And also, please put philosophy back in the American curriculum. You'll never get enlightened Americans as long as you regard religion as a private matter to be left to the indoctrination of the home, because that way you can never progress and advance. Each family in their own, whatever it is, sect, will just indoctrinate the kids. No, religion is far too important to be left to simply private orientation. There has to be public school education about religious studies. And I strongly recommend that all American schools, once you're president, use the periodic table of the world's religious and philosophical systems. It can be called Religious Studies and Philosophy, which is what it is. And as in the UK, it should be a compulsory lesson, at least 3 or 4 periods a week, because then kids learn about Islam, Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, all the different types of Christianity, new religious movements, humanism, Confucianism, Taoism. And so the world doesn't seem such a frightening and scary place that you need to go and shoot people like so many Americans are doing. They seem to think it's all too confusing, the answer is to shoot people in the mall. Come on. Marianne, I hope you're listening. Okay, moving on, we come to our Christians. And today we celebrate 2 in particular. Nathan Soderblom, who was an amazing Swedish ecumenical thinker. I've always loved his work. He was way ahead of the game. And he was from near Stockholm. He was brought up in Trono, which is near Söderhamn, educated at Uppsala, which is a town I know and love well in Sweden. It used to be a sacred grove to Odin, who was the god of wisdom for the ancient Anglo-Saxon, Germanic and Scandinavian peoples. I love Odin. And this was his sanctuary, a tree sanctuary. Now, it became, after Christianization, it became one of the greatest Christian centres in the whole of Scandinavia, and Sweden in particular. Has a fantastic library, which I visited. And he became a student at the University of Uppsala and was ordained there in 1893. Became a minister of the Swedish church in Paris. Well, that must have been an amazing job, can you imagine? In sort of late 1890s. And then he went back to become Professor of History of Religion at Uppsala in 1901, which was just the time religious studies was getting off the ground. And he was a pioneer in comparative religious studies. There'd been no chairs really up to that point. You did theology within your little patch, but you didn't do comparative across the world type religious studies, which is what I do. He then became Professor of History of Religion at Leipzig in Germany, another great university, in 1912. He saw World War coming and thought it was a horrendous mistake, a horrendous idea. What were these nations thinking of doing about, the bombast of diplomacy and all that nonsense leading to war? In 1914, he was appointed Archbishop back in Uppsala, and he became primate, or the Archbishop of the whole Lutheran Church. And what a terrible time to be appointed, 1914, right on the cusp of World War One. Now the Swedes very cleverly stayed out of World War One. They weren't so stupid as to get sucked into a ridiculous propaganda battle. And he watched in horror as these so-called Christian nations, France, Britain, Germany, Russia, Italy, all started killing each other. All supposedly mainly Christian. And yet here they are mass slaughtering and 20 million die in the trenches. There's a terrible peace museum in Kobarid about the trench warfare that happened in the Alps on the Slovenian-Italian front. And there's a photograph there that I find very sobering of a priest in the Austro-Hungarian army giving the mass, holding up the wafer to his Catholic troops on a hillside, who are all armed and togged for battle. They've got their guns. They're about to go into war. This is the last mass before the frontal assault. Who are they going to attack? They're going to attack other Catholics, other Christians, who happen to be Italian, speak a slightly different language. It to me sums up the stupidity of World War One. And Soderblom watched all this in horror. The Swedes watched it in horror. And he said, we have to create an ecumenical movement, chaps. We have to get all the Christians of all of, not just Europe, but the whole world together. They're supposed to be brothers and sisters. Yet they've just slaughtered each other in this mass carnage. So he worked tirelessly for the ecumenical movement. They launched in Edinburgh. They had a big meeting in Edinburgh, which he helped organise, which became later the World Council of Churches. And he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1930 for this work. And he's one of the saints that we celebrate today. Sadly, he died in 1931, or he would have done his best to stop World War II. He would have probably personally tried to stop it, as anyone with any sense would have done. So we celebrate his amazing work and life as an Archbishop of Sweden. And that's one of the reasons why Sweden has been so good on peace issues. Why, when I was working to try and create a peace institute at the University of London, I went to Sweden and met people in Norway. They were the most supportive, really, of all the peoples that I'd met around the world, saying, yes, London deserves a peace institute, like Stockholm has. Well, it still does, my friends. And after we stop Brexit, I still hope the reforming government that will fund a proper peace research institute in London, with, the ability to do the detailed academic scientific work on preventing conflict that they do in Sweden, that we should be doing in the UK and throughout Europe. I also celebrate today another great Christian saint, this time called Saint Frumentius, who was the apostle of Ethiopia. Now, I love this man. He was an amazing guy from Tyre in Phoenicia at the 4th century. He was born sometime in the early 4th century, died in 383 AD in Ethiopia. And the story is that he was a Syro-Phoenician Greek who, as a boy, was captured with his brother and taken and sold into slavery and ended up in the kingdom of Aksum in Ethiopia. And he was initially just a slave, and then, a bit like St. Patrick, he eventually managed to convert these Ethiopians, and he was given the job because he became the personal assistant slave to the king of Axumites. He was so impressed by his character that he made him tutor to his son, the crown prince. And when that boy became king of Axum, then the Christianization of the country started. He was a scholar, first and foremost. He also went back up to Alexandria, where the great Christian hierarchy was based for that part of Egypt and the world. And then he was reappointed as the first ever bishop to the Ethiopian people. And his life is celebrated on this day officially by the Ethiopian Church and the Universal Church, including all the different branches of the Orthodox Church. What I love about the Ethiopian Christians, I mean, he helped translate the Bible into Ethiopian, is that the Ethiopian Bible has kept the Book of Enoch. Of all the Christian branches in the world, Anglican, Orthodox, whatever, the Ethiopian seems to be the only one that's kept the Book of Enoch, which is very bizarre, because the Book of Enoch is an amazing esoteric text which I've commented on, and it tells the story of the fall of man, the fall of Lucifer, the war between good and evil, the eventual triumph of the good. It tells the story of Enoch visiting heaven and his visions that he sees. He was a prophet living between Noah and Moses, and long before he was a prophet between Adam and Noah. He's the grandfather of Noah. And he's mentioned in the book of Genesis that is in our Bibles. And it says that Enoch walked with God. But it doesn't explain anything more. You have to read the book of Enoch to see what the backstory was. Now, in my commentary on the Bible, I've proved, I think, I mean, it's not just me, but scholars realise that Christ himself had a copy of this book of Enoch. His disciples did. They were studying it. It's been found in the Qumran texts that were scattered, versions of the book of Enoch there. So the Essenes are reading it. Anyone who was anybody in esoteric Judaism at the time of Christ, and a century or so before, was studying this book. And it's where it describes the function of the Son of Man in detail. What's the Son of Man going to do? Well, he's going to come to earth and bring peace. And it was as if Christ had read the book of Enoch. Oh, and judgment, by the way, not just peace, but, judgment, truth, righteousness. The package deal that is peace. And so Christ is obviously reading the book of Enoch. Well, these dear Ethiopians realised that. They stuck it in their Bibles. I think the Archbishop of Canterbury should immediately order that the Book of Enoch should be reprinted and published with every single Bible that is published by Oxford or Cambridge University or whatever. The official King James Bible needs updating. We didn't know it existed when we did the King James Bible. King James didn't know. He was a great scholar. He would have made sure it was in there. It was brought back to Europe by an amazing Scottish Freemason called James Bruce, who went to Ethiopia overland, great story, adventures, make a great movie. And he found the Book of Enoch. He was shown it, he was taught it, he was friends with the king, just like Frumentius. And then he made it back overland, up the Nile, to Egypt and home. And he brought with him 3 copies of this amazing, precious book, the Book of Enoch. He gave 1 copy to the King of France, it's in the Royal Library in Paris. And then he gave 1 copy to the Bodleian in Oxford, where it still is. And then he kept 1 copy, took home to Scotland. Bruce was an amazing man. He wrote up his adventures. That book in the Bodleian, a library I know and love well, was eventually translated into English, and it hit the early 1800s intellectuals with, like a bombshell of enlightenment. And Blake knew it, Shelley knew it, all the romantic poets knew it. Gosh, suddenly everything made sense. You should read it. And also listen to my commentary, which is on my Global Green University website, because I've helped people through this complex text with a detailed explanation of each verse. There are 2 other books of Enoch that were written slightly later, but in the same genre. And they're very proto-Kabbalistic, so to speak. Okay, so there we celebrate Frumentius. And again, what I'm saying is that my reading of these saints is all of them would be against this Brexit nonsense, this nightmare of stupidity, of narrowing down of our potential, of sticking us back into some small little identity, called Englishness or Britishness or whatever you want to call it. Whereas we're actually co-citizens of the universal kingdom of the gods, the kingdom of the heavens, and that's our spiritual destination. Okay. I want to just read something now, talking about Christianity and the kingdom of God. What do I mean? What is that? This is a quote from a dear friend of mine who's now departed, no longer with us, but a man called Rob Lacey, who wrote a thing called the Street Bible. When I taught religious studies in Mansfield for 2 happy years, difficult years, because kids were really not into religious studies, but, they taught me an awful lot, because to teach kids like that about God, you have to be absolutely, on your game, and you have to have integrity. You can't bluster and bluff. Like Boris Johnson in the last 2 seconds in the kind of classrooms I was facing, they'd see through his game and, he'd be laughed out of the school. So one of the things was I was given this book, The Street Bible, by the head of IT, who said, Thomas, this is the language the kids use now. And Rob Lacey, who was from Wales, translated the Bible into street English. It's a masterpiece. And I think the point is that that universal message I'm talking about has to be put into the language people use. It has to appeal to people at the level of discourse and culture that we're used to, everyday life. I'm going to quote from his translation. So it's an adaptation into modern English of the Testament of Matthew and the Sermon on the Mount, a place I've visited. I've travelled to Israel several times, and I've stood on the place where this sermon was given. I've mused on it, I've meditated there, I've prayed. What did he really mean? What was that about? This is the best ever translation, and this to me is like a wake-up call to resist Brexit. Jesus sees how the troop of groupies is growing. So he goes up the nearest hill and lets them follow. They listen in as he teaches his team. I'll tell you who'll laugh last. The people who don't think too much of themselves, who know they're a mess. Their ticket to heaven's already in the post, first class. I tell you who'll still be laughing. The people who know about grief, who don't shove the mess behind the sofa, but face it. God himself is going to put his arm around them. I'll tell you who'll laugh longest. The modest, gentle types, who don't go round grabbing. They'll get given the world. Who'll be laughing? The people who only want to do the right thing. Like it's their food and drink. Their good news in tray will be piled high. Who'll be laughing? The people who don't hold grudges, who forgive and forget. They'll get treated likewise. Who's laughing deep down already? The people who aren't polluted with stuff that mugs the heart. They'll get to see God. Who's laughing deep down? The people who stop fights and start friendships, who turn fists into high fives. They'll get known as God's children. Who's laughing? The people who get slapped down for doing the right thing. They get given the security code to heaven's gates and the heavenly library, I'll add. And you're laughing if people despise you. You're delirious if they pick on you. If they slag you off just because you're on my side, throw a party. Go wild. Paint the town. Your bonus in heaven is hitting the humongous mark. Because that's exactly what they did to all the couriers who predicted my arrival. Yeah, okay, Rob Lacey, I take my hat off to you. That's his translation of Matthew 5, 1 to 13, 1 to 12. And it's a masterpiece. And the point you can get from that, if you if you haven't got it already, is that Christ is on the side of the universal, the people that struggle and strive for righteousness. And we may be like downtrodden and not taken seriously by the media, but ultimately, the good news is out there. That's what that text is about. And that's what inspired people like Nathan Soderblom to attempt the miraculous of getting all the Christian tribes to make peace. It's what made Frumentius go to Ethiopia and share that good news. And it's what should be inspiring our anti-Brexit mission, which is an anti-Christian project right from day one. It's incredible to me that anybody that calls himself any kind of Christian could ever have bought into it as a project. It's the most anti-Christian movement I've seen in my lifetime in Britain. Finally, Mr. Welby, Justin Welby, the Archbishop of Canterbury, has woken up, and he's been condemning the political extremism of Boris Johnson for his rhetoric in Parliament, when he's most viciously rude and insulting, particularly to poor old Jeremy Corbyn, who seems quite a nice, kind, decent, sort of Fabian-type chap. And this man, Boris Johnson, importing an entirely different rhetorical style. Welby's right to say it's a polarisation that is alien to our culture. Britain doesn't do that kind of polarisation. Well, it's come from Steve Bannon, it's come from the American hard right, it's come from Donald Trump, and that extremism, as Welby says, if you're not on my political project, you're my total enemy. Sorry, that's not the British way of doing stuff. You're still my friend even though I disagree with your policies, and I will still hope to convert you to rationality, but only using reason and civil and polite discourse. That's what we discovered is the only way to get our country as a peace haven. So let's please have our country back for civilised discourse. And thank you, Justin Welby, finally sticking your head above the parapet. Now I want to move on a little bit. And I want to celebrate something else today that is incredibly important to me. It's something I've been discovering recently, and I had a very dear friend come and visit me recently here, who's studying Chinese medicine, and who was learning, the metaphysics behind Chinese medicine. She recommended to me a book. She brought a book with her called The Web That Has No Weaver by Ted Kapchuk, which I have been studying ever since, engrossed. Its Chinese medicine is incredible, and Chinese philosophy is something I've studied for many years. I've always wanted to be, amongst everything else, a doctor like Schweitzer, and I would always want to reconcile Chinese and Western medicine and philosophy in one thing. So what is the essence of Chinese medicine? Kapchuk, amazing, he's a professor at Harvard of comparative history of medicine, which again is, it's never taught in schools in Britain. You can even study as a doctor in the UK medical schools and never learn about the history and philosophy of medicine. You can just sort of learn this is the pills, these are the symptoms, that's called diagnosis, that's called, therapy. You never actually learn the subtle complexity of what true medicine is all about. So I think the medical curriculum in Britain needs a huge upgrade. And one of the few Conservative MPs I like is David Tredinnick, who's standing down at the next election, who's been tirelessly campaigning for complementary and alternative medicine to be part of the NHS. He gave a brilliant speech in Parliament where he reported on a mission he'd just done to Delhi. He'd met ministers of health who are promoting alternative and homeopathic medicine in the Indian system. There are something like 50,000 clinics all over India doing homeopathic medicine, which was a Western invention by Samuel Hahnemann, a great Christian and a Freemason, who realised that you don't have to cure illness with huge doses of therapeutic allopathic medicines. You can stimulate the self-healing of the body by giving them a tiny little dose of the thing that's causing it. It's completely paradoxical, but then, hey, life, as Hegel pointed out, is dialectical and paradoxical. Everything operates in a kind of mirror image of itself, which is exactly what Chinese philosophy says. Everything is yin and yang, looking in a mirror.